My Weirder-est School, Book Number 11. Mrs. Stoker is a Joker. Written by Dan Gutman. Pictures by Jim Palott. Chapter 5. DEAR. When we got back to Mr. Cooper's class, it was DEAR time. That stands for Drop Everything and Read. We have to sit quietly and read a book for 15 whole minutes. Ugh, reading books is boring. I don't even know why you're reading this one. I looked around. Ryan was reading. Michael was reading. Alexia was reading. Even Neil was reading, and he hates reading as much as I do. Everybody was reading. But you know who wasn't reading? The biggest reader of them all, Little Miss Perfect. Andrea was sitting there with her mean face on. "What's the matter?" I whispered to her. "Was your clog dancing lesson cancelled today?" "No," Andrea whispered back. "I have a problem with Mrs. Stoker." "More reading, less talking," said Mr. Cooper. "This is DEAR time, kids." "What do you have against Mrs. Stoker?" I whispered to Andrea. "She's going to make a terrible principal," whispered Andrea. "But she's funny," I whispered back. "Stop talking, you two," warned Mr. Cooper. "Mrs. Stoker is so immature," Andrea whispered. "Grown-ups are supposed to act grown-up." "You need to get a sense of humor transplant," I whispered to Andrea. "Ooh," whispered Ryan. "AJ and Andrea are whispering secret messages to each other. They must be in love." "When are you gonna get married?" whispered Michael. "I said stop it," shouted Mr. Cooper. "You're going to get us in trouble, Arlo," whispered Andrea. "Your face is in trouble," I whispered back at her. "All right," shouted Mr. Cooper. "That's the last straw." "Huh? What do straws have to do with anything? Why are grown-ups always running out of straws? If you ask me, they should buy a new box of straws before the old one is empty." "AJ and Andrea," shouted Mr. Cooper. "Both of you, go to the principal's office." "What did I do?" I asked. But, I giggled because Andrea said but, which sounds just like but, even though it only has one T. Andrea and I walked 1,100,000 miles to the principal's office. She was so mad she wouldn't speak to me the whole time. Andrea never gets in trouble. She probably figured this was going to be on her permanent record and prevent her from getting into Harvard someday. When we got to the principal's office, nobody was there. The door was open, so we walked in. The office was almost empty. There was no desk or anything, just a bare brick wall with a stool in front of it and a microphone on a stand. That was weird. Mrs. Patty, the school secretary, came in. She had 2 folding chairs. "Have a seat," she told us. "Mrs. Stoker will be here in a minute. Would you kids like some milk?" Okay," Andrea and I replied. Mrs. Patty went out and came back with 2 cartons of milk for each of us. "Here, have a second carton," she said as she handed us the milk. "I don't want another carton of milk," I told her. "You have to take another carton," she replied. "Why?" "We have a 2-drink minimum," said Mrs. Patty. That was weird. Andrea and I sat down. The lights went off. Mrs. Patty went over to the microphone. "And now," she said dramatically, "straight from Giggles Comedy Club, put your hands together for our very own Mrs. Stoker." A spotlight came on, and Mrs. Stoker jogged into the office. Andrea and I clapped. "Thank you," Mrs. Stoker said. "It's great to be here. Hey, what are you doing under there?" Underwear? I asked. Ha ha, said Mrs. Stoker. I made you say underwear. Andrea rolled her eyes. Are you going to punish us for talking during DEAR time? She asked. Yes, said Mrs. Stoker. Your punishment is that you have to listen to my new comedy routine. Did you hear about the embarrassed toilet? It was flushed. That reminds me of the policeman who flushed his toilet. Well, he had to. It was his duty. Wow, I'd never heard a grown-up say duty before. They always say it's okay to say duty, but we shouldn't say duty. Nobody knows why. Those words sound way too much alike if you ask me. Andrea looked mad. Not into toilet humor, eh? Asked Mrs. Stoker. How about animals, Andrea? Do you like animals? I guess, Andrea replied. When I was a little girl, I had a pony, said Mrs. Stoker. He was terrible at singing. Well, he was a little horse. Get it? A little horse? And my dog is a terrible dancer. He has 2 left feet and 2 right feet. Andrea rolled her eyes again. Why did the dinosaur cross the road? Mrs. Stoker asked. I give up, I said. Because chickens didn't exist back then, she said, doubling over with laughter. Hey, what did the banana say to the dog? I have no idea, I replied. Nothing, said Mrs. Stoker. Bananas can't talk. Andrea rolled her eyes again. Can we go back to class now? She asked. I promise we won't talk during DEAR time anymore. Not yet, said Mrs. Stoker. I have a few more animal jokes. Did I tell you about my pet bee? His hair is getting too long. I think I'll give him a buzz cut. Get it? Hey, do you know what's black and white and looks like a penguin? What? Andrea asked. A penguin, shouted Mrs. Stoker. No more, begged Andrea. Please, just give us detention. We'll do anything. We'll never talk during DEAR time again. You promise? Asked Mrs. Stoker. We promise, Andrea and I said. Well, okay, said Mrs. Stoker. You've been a wonderful audience. Don't forget to tip your waitress, Mrs. Patty, on your way out. Even I was beginning to have my doubts about Mrs. Stoker. She's ridiculous.